Dissociative amnesia. You know what that is?
It's a dissociation is basically where you forget who you are. There's various forms of disassociation, but people with dissociative amnesia typically do things like completely forget who they are, move out of town, start a new life. This is like what Kermit the Frog had in the Muppets Take Manhattan. That's like a really good example of it, actually.
If you enjoy this podcast, show us some love and take a couple minutes to leave a 5-star review. It helps us get found by more listeners, and we greatly appreciate it. Aphantasia is a condition characterized by an inability to visualize mental images in one's mind. If you have just discovered that you or someone you love has aphantasia, or if you're just fascinated by the subject in general and love learning more about it, you are in the right place. The Discovering Your Mind podcast delves into all aspects of the mind's eye, including aphantasia, hyperphantasia, and everything in between. Welcome to the Discovering Your Mind podcast, brought to you by shanesbraindomain.com. I am your host, Shane Williams, also known as Shane's Brain, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Cole Williams. Say hi, Cole.
What's up, guys?
This is a topic that I've wanted to focus in on for a while now. It's a topic that we discuss on some level in every episode, and I think it deserves a closer look. That topic is memory.
I think we could do a lot of episodes on memory.
Yeah, as I was doing the research, it got kind of overwhelming. There was so much. I think we could probably do 12 episodes on memory, but we're going to cut it to 3. So today is going to be the first one, and we're going to be talking primarily about poor memory or memory deficiencies. We're going to start there, all right?
Okay.
The first thing I want to do is just define autobiographical memory. Autobiographical memory is a memory system consisting of episodes recollected from an individual's life based on a combination of episodic memory. Do you know what that is, Cole?
Memory of specific events?
Yes, personal experiences and specific objects, people, and events experienced at particular time and place. The other one is semantic memory. And what is that, Cole?
That is general knowledge.
Correct. General knowledge and facts about the world. You know, on this podcast, we have talked a lot about aphantasia, obviously, but we haven't talked a whole lot about SDAM or SDAM, which a lot of people with aphantasia identify as having. Do you know what SDAM stands for?
I believe it is severely deficient autobiographical memory.
You got it right.
Hooray! College classes are doing something for me, I guess.
All right. So basically, it's defined as a lifelong inability to vividly recollect or re-experience personal past events from a first-person perspective. Now, based on that definition, it does sound a lot like aphantasia to me. And I have heard some people speculate that aphantasia and SDAM are the same thing.
I was going to say it sounds the same to me. That's the first thing I thought of, because it's not like they can't remember things. Like, obviously, they'll remember if they went to Disneyland or something, but they just can't experience it from a first-person perspective again, which still sounds a lot like the aphantasia experience. But I'm interested to hear what you say.
Yeah, so I've struggled with whether I have SDAM or not, because some of the things I read, it sounds like, well, yeah, I can't do that. Like that definition there, I would say, yeah, I have SDAM. But that definition there sounds to me like aphantasia. I want to try and distinguish those two a little bit today, because overall, I feel like I have a good memory. So even though visually I can't, as it says, vividly recollect or re-experience personal past events from a first-person perspective, I can't do that visually in my mind. but I still feel like I have a decent autobiographical memory. So I've never really considered myself as having SDAM because I feel like my memory is pretty good, right?
It could be that visual imagery for some people is necessary for creating those memories. And if they don't have it, their memory is just bad.
As I said, I'm kind of in the air, like, do I have SDAM? What is SDAM? Is it aphantasia, but just call it something different? Like, I want to try and understand it better. So I think one of the best ways to do that is I found an article about Susie McKinnon. This is from an article titled In a Perpetual Present. So I'm just going to read some of this and we can talk about it. So it says, Susie McKinnon is the first person ever identified with a condition called severely deficient autobiographical memory, or SDAM. She knows plenty of facts about her life, but she lacks the ability to mentally relive any of it, the way you or I might meander back into our minds and evoke a particular afternoon. She has no episodic memories, none of those impressionistic recollections that feel a bit like scenes from a movie, always filmed from your perspective. I know bits and pieces of stuff that happened, McKinnon says, of her own childhood, but none of it bears a vivid first-person stamp. I have no images or impressions of myself as a kid. She finds herself guessing a lot as to whatever her experiences must have been like. She assumes the Cayman Islands were hot. Perhaps she and her husband walked around a lot there. It was probably sometime between 2000 and 2010, she ventures. This article, throughout the whole thing, it doesn't mention aphantasia at all.
Okay.
But it does say there that she has no images of herself as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
So my guess is that she probably has aphantasia. Some of that sounds very, very aphantasic to me, and some of it doesn't.
Yeah.
So what do you think?
I have two things to say about it. First, it does sound like she has aphantasia, but it also sounds like she has something more, because like if you were remembering a vacation to Florida or whatever, you could remember if it was hot or not, right?
Oh, yeah.
So many more details are lost from her than just that of what we would consider like visual stuff. Like she can't remember the exact date, the feelings, anything, except for like the very basic details. The other thing I was going to say is the article's a little off there when they said she has no episodic memory. Just knowing I went to the Cayman Islands, that is episodic memory. And she remembers a thing about her past life. That is episodic memory. It's severely lacking, but she has a little bit.
Yeah, I would say, and that is the big difference I noticed right away too, is even though my memories aren't visual, they're still there, right? I don't know how to describe how they're still there, but it's not like I've forgotten them. It's just I can't experience that visual, vivid first person thing they're describing, but in my way, the memory is intact. Right. And even though I can't, remember everything, I don't think anybody can do that other than some of the people we'll talk about in the next episode. But you know what I mean? Like, and there are things that I struggle with as far as time wise. I mean, she says there, it was probably sometime between 2000 and 2010. Like that's a big gap, right?
That's significant.
But I do struggle with that. Sometimes I'm like, I don't know how long ago that was, but I usually can do it closer than that 10-year gap.
So I'm developing a little bit of a hypothesis here because it seems like aphantasia is tied strongly to SDAM, but I don't think aphantasia is SDAM. I think one affects the other, though.
Right. It makes sense that a lot of people with aphantasia would also have SDAM. Mm-hmm. But like everything else, there's no 100% this equals this. And so
right. I think it is different between struggling with just having a poor memory and having SDAM, because SDAM seems like a more significant, it almost becomes a disability. I would say I know we never say aphantasia is a disability, but I would say if it gets to the point of SDAM, that's a bit more of a disability.
Okay. So this next part says, like McKinnon, people with amnesia usually lose their episodic memories and keep their semantic ones. But amnesiacs tend to come by their memory loss through brain trauma, developmental disorders, or degenerative conditions, and they are often impaired in their day-to-day functioning. They cannot live normal lives. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about amnesia since they brought it up here, and we're going to talk more about it later. Amnesia is a general term describing memory loss. Symptoms include memory loss, confusion, and the inability to recognize familiar faces or places. So let's talk about this real quick, because honestly, at this point, SDAM seems to have a lot more in common with amnesia than it does aphantasia to me. What do you think?
I think so. I wanted to point out a quick fun fact. I don't know if it has a ton to do with what we're talking about, but it might. You mentioned that amnesia patients often lose their episodic memory, but not their semantic memory. There's actually a third type of memory that amnesia patients also keep, which is their procedural memory, which is like muscle memory type stuff.
Would you say, though, that there are some cases of amnesia that could be nearly identical to SDAM? I know that amnesia can be more severe, but I feel like there could be a case of someone with amnesia and a case with someone with SDAM where it's pretty darn close to being the same experience.
Yeah, there are forms of amnesia called acute amnesia where you only forget like certain details or certain events. So I could see in particular cases it seeming very similar to SDAM. I think you are right that one of the main differences is that amnesia is usually caused through some form of trauma, and SDAM is a congenital thing.
Okay, so why not just name it amnesia and say it's this kind of amnesia? Why do we have to have a new name for it?
You got me. I don't know.
All right, just thinking out loud here.
No, that's a really good question, and maybe it should be. Maybe it should just be thrown in the category with other amnesias.
All right, and obviously I'm no expert here. I'm just throwing out my thoughts.
Another distinction is SDAM seems to be a weird combination of both retrograde and anterograde amnesia. For a better explanation, retrograde amnesia is the normal amnesia we think about, which is the inability to remember things about your past. Now, there's a rarer form called anterograde amnesia, which is the inability to create new memories. It almost feels like SDAM is somewhere in the middle of those two because both new memories and old memories seem to have the same amount of problem.
Okay. So where do you think aphantasia plays a role in all of that? Do you think aphantasia plays a role in amnesia at all?
I don't think so.
But I think SDAM does, because when they're defining that, they're specifically saying there's no vivid experience from a first-person perspective, where I don't think any of that kind of language enters into amnesia.
Right. The thing about amnesia is you just can't remember it at all, whatever is lost.
Right.
So it wouldn't matter to ask them if they could experience it from a first-person perspective. They don't know what you're talking about.
Okay. All right. The article says this, and this is talking about one of the researchers. It says, when Levine and colleagues quizzed McKinnon about events that her friends and relatives described, like the time she was in The Sound of Music during high school, she has no such recollection. The interview seemed to confirm that, sure enough, McKinnon had no recognizable episodic memories.
Interesting.
So just from that right there, I'm like, okay, I don't have SDAM, because I may forget a thing here and there, but I have memories like that. If I was in The Sound of Music, I would remember it in my way.
And that does sound like what they claimed is no episodic memory. She does not remember it at all. It is interesting that the farther we go, the more it sounds like amnesia. except for there was no like injury or trauma that caused her to suddenly forget all these things. She just never really processed them correctly, which sounds a lot like anterograde amnesia.
All right, more from the article. McKinnon also quickly forgets arguments, which might be the reason she and her husband have stayed together for so long, she joked. She cannot hold a grudge. She is unfamiliar with the feeling of regret and oblivious to the diminishments of aging. A 1972 yearbook photo shows that she was once a petite brunette with a delicate face framed by a pixie cut. On an intellectual level, McKinnon knows that is her. But put the picture away, and in her mind, she has always been the 60-year-old woman she is now. She doesn't know what it's like to linger in a memory, to long for the past, to dwell in it. Okay, so I recently interviewed Stacey Farian.
Okay.
And she said that when she looks at a picture of herself from her childhood, or even a picture of herself from 10 years ago, it feels like a stranger. And Stacey does identify as having SDAM.
So it doesn't seem like maybe as severe as this article we're talking about, but I can imagine that SDAM comes in various forms of severity. But it does sound very similar, where there's not an autobiographical recollection there.
Yeah, I think SDAM is like everything else. There's a broad range of experiences with it. A couple more things I want to just quote from here.
Okay.
Once she decided to keep a journal to see if she could preserve her memories. I stopped doing that after 2 or 3 days, she says. If I get so obsessed with capturing every moment because I'm afraid of losing the memory, I'm never going to experience those moments. McKinnon once borrowed a video camera to film one of their departures on a Caribbean cruise, but she didn't enjoy it. She lost the feeling of the moment, she says. She likewise doesn't take photos. She says she doesn't find them that compelling to look at. All right. So any thoughts on that? I thought that was interesting.
I don't know. I like my first thought was like, that seems kind of empty, but to her, it seems like it's not. You know, it seems like she's kind of carved out a life in the never-ending present she lives in.
Right. That's what I was going to say. It sounds to me like she is so comfortable in the present moment because of her condition that the past doesn't really interest her. It's gone forever, and she's content with that.
That is weird.
Now, on the flip side, I have heard people with aphantasia say they take tons of pictures because that fills that void of not being able to picture it themselves. So they really rely on having a lot of pictures, and that's how they, quote unquote, relive their memories and things like that.
Right. And it almost sounds like a personal preference. She could live her life preoccupied with trying to remember everything that happens, or she could just enjoy her life, know that she'll have good experiences even if she can't quite remember them, and just live her life.
I'm kind of somewhere in the middle because I do like looking at pictures, and it does help me remember, vacations and things that I did. Mm-hmm. But in the moment, I hate taking pictures. Like, I'm not a picture taker. I hate posing for them. I hate taking them. Like, in the moment, I don't want to mess with a picture. What are your memories like? Do you feel like you have a good memory?
I think I have a pretty good memory, except for important things that I'm supposed to do on a particular day. That's what my calendar app is for. I have a very aggressive calendar app. But as far as like autobiographical memory, I think it's pretty good. I can bring up a memory and see it from a first person or third person perspective and just relive it. Maybe that's why I don't care for pictures that much, because it's kind of feels useless.
Right. All right. One last quote from the article.
Okay.
Well, it's abundantly clear that McKenna isn't using the technology to become more like us. It's conceivable that technology could, over the long run, make us all a bit more like her. My iPhone now holds 1,217 photos and 159 videos just from the past 8 months. By focusing on clicking picture after picture, I may actually be blurring away my memories of these experiences through something researchers call the photo-taking impairment effect. And by automatically storing all those photos in the cloud, which relieves my mind from the burden of containing a bunch of memories, I may be short-circuiting some part of my own process of episodic memory formation.
This has been talked about a lot, and it's this theory that cell phones and social media and all this stuff is good, but it is slowly killing our minds. And there is some backing to that. For example, back in the 80s and 90s, you probably remembered a lot more phone numbers than you do now, right?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
And now it's taken care of for you. So the theory is that now if you tried to do that again, it would be significantly harder because your brain is now just used to relying on the phone. Remember these phone numbers for me.
Right.
And so it's the more we gain a reliance on technology, the worse our minds are going to get at recalling this information, pulling it up, using it effectively. And I think AI has definitely taken a hit on that. The amount, like I work in a high school, the amount of high schoolers that I've seen that cannot just like productively think of their own ideas and have to turn to AI for everything. It's kind of scary.
Yeah, that's true. In a lot of ways, our minds are kind of turned into mush because we don't have to use them the way we used to have to use them.
Yeah. I mean, the brain is a muscle, or it's like a muscle. If you don't exercise it properly, you're going to lose your abilities.
Things are pleasant in the little town of Quiet until Mel Beezer discovers he's allergic to his own sneezes. Blending wit and humor with lively imagery, The Endless Achoo is a delightfully clever tale, available on shanesbraindomain.com and Amazon. So let's talk a little bit more about amnesia. So the first one is retrograde amnesia, which is what?
The inability to remember past events.
Correct. Dissociative amnesia. You know what that is?
It's a dissociation is basically where you forget who you are. There's various forms of disassociation, but people with dissociative amnesia typically do things like completely forget who they are, move out of town, start a new life. This is like what Kermit the Frog had in the Muppets Take Manhattan. That's like a really good example of it, actually.
In love with a pig? Oh, wait till I tell the guys in marketing. Hi, maybe you expect me to go hog wild? Maybe, perhaps you could bring home the bacon, huh? Oh, the sounds of love. Sweet, oink, oink.
Localized amnesia. What's that?
I used to know.
This says that it is a loss of memory for one sense, while other senses are unaffected. This can be caused by damage to a specific part of the brain.
That makes sense.
So if you lose the memory of one sense, does that mean like you can remember eating the popcorn, but you can't remember what it smells like?
Exactly.
Okay. And then the one you said earlier, I can't pronounce it.
Anterograde?
There you go. Anterograde amnesia. Inability to transfer new information from short-term memory to long-term memory.
It sounds like the scariest thing ever.
Okay. So let's talk about Clive Waring. What do you know about him?
Okay. Clive Waring was he was a composer. He had an accident. I cannot remember what the accident is.
It was an illness.
Oh, it was an illness.
I can't remember what the illness was, but I know it was an illness.
He developed anterograde amnesia, and now he is essentially stuck in the exact place in time where he first developed anterograde amnesia. He can remember his entire life before that, but he's lived years since that event, but still believes no time has passed since then. I remember there are several studies have been done on Clive Waring because it's a very interesting subject. And one researcher said he sat in with Clive Waring, had a normal conversation with him. He was very polite, very cordial, acted like a normal human being. The researcher walked out of the room for 1 minute, came back in, said, "Have you ever seen me before?" And Clive said, "No, I have no idea who you are." And it's amazing because his procedural and semantic memory are still there. Like before the accident, he played the piano beautifully. He can still do that. He won't remember what he just played for you, but he can still sit down at a piano and play every piece he's learned before that accident or that illness.
Okay. So I'm going to read some of this. You summed that up pretty well, but some of these other interesting points.
Yeah, love to hear it.
His memory for events lasts between 7 and 30 seconds. He spends every day waking up every 20 seconds or so, restarting his consciousness once the time span of his short-term memory has elapsed. During this time, he repeatedly questions why he has not seen a doctor, as he constantly believes he has only recently awoken from a comatose state.
Okay. I've got a picture to share with you actually on this topic, if that's okay.
Cole is sharing a diary written by Clive Waring. If you would like to see it, there is a link to it in the show notes.
This is a journal that Clive Waring kept one time for research. From the moment he woke up and pretty much like every minute or so or several minutes after that. And you can notice the first one, he says, "I wake for the first time." This second one, literally a minute later, "This illness has been like death till now. All senses work." Basically, he's waking up again.
Right.
And then later on, you hear him repeat over and over again, "I am totally, completely awake. Now I am 100% overwhelmingly awake this time." It's like he's waking up over and over again. And honestly, like it sounds like the most terrifying thing you can ever experience.
Right. I'm going to read a little bit more. I have one more little thing I want to read on him. Waring remembers little of his life before 1985. He knows, for example, that he has children from an earlier marriage, but he cannot remember their names. His love for his second wife, Deborah, whom he married the year before his illness began, is undiminished. He greets her joyously every time they meet, believing either he has not seen her in years or that they have never met before, even though she may have just left the room momentarily. When he goes out dining with his wife, he can remember the names of food, but he cannot link them with taste, as he forgets what food he is eating by the time it has reached his mouth.
That is weird.
It really does kind of sound like a personal hell.
Yeah, seriously. But that's interesting because it seems like there's it seems like there's also some retrograde amnesia there too, because, you know, he can't remember the names of his children and certain things. So it seems like maybe the illness had some retrograde effects too, but the more prominent one is that anterograde personal hell. I'm not an expert in the subject, but I would say SDAM sounds a lot like amnesia, and I'm not quite sure why we make such a distinction between the two, because SDAM just sounds like anterograde amnesia that someone was born with. And it sounds like she's still able to like gain semantic memories, but like everything's episodic she remembers, she doesn't really bring in or process or get long-term storage for. So that sounds a lot like anterograde amnesia.
Maybe the difference that they're making is the link to aphantasia, the link to visually not being able to remember in first person. Because everywhere the SDAM is talked about, they link it to aphantasia, but they don't link it to amnesia. And so I don't know why that is. It feels like there's something about aphantasia that links it stronger to SDAM, where amnesia just is kind of like a similar thing, but necessarily doesn't have anything to do with aphantasia.
And that's the fun thing about aphantasia is we get to ask questions about aphantasia along every other field of psychology now, like every other little thing.
Right. And in the article about McKinnon, it does mention in there that she doesn't see images. It never specifically mentions aphantasia, but it does sound like that's part of her experience. Maybe the difference is amnesia can affect anybody, right?
Mm-hmm.
You could have hyperphantasia and still have amnesia. But could you have hyperphantasia and have SDAM? See, that I'm not so sure about.
Yeah, I don't think so. It really sounds, from what I heard and what you said about SDAM, it sounds a lot like it's very connected to her visual information. It's that I can't see it, I can't remember it kind of thing.
So amnesia, you don't necessarily have to have aphantasia.
That's what it sounds like.
But SDAM, possibly you do have to have aphantasia.
So maybe that's the key factor there.
Yeah, maybe that's the link.
I'm always afraid when we make these like guesses and hypotheses about things that some researcher, someone's going to email us like, you have no idea what you're talking about. What are you doing?
Well, on the flip side, there's a lot of things that researchers say and do where I could email them and say the same thing.
That's fair.
We're upfront about who we are and what we know. But I think this is where the magic happens. Just talking about things, throwing out some ideas, I think it has value for sure.
I think it does have value, and it definitely has applicable value, because I think a lot of the times researchers say, this is how it is and good luck. Right. And we actually talk about what it means and how it's important and like why these things are important and how they apply to people's lives. And I think that has a lot of value to it.
Right. And when we're speculating, we're honest that we're speculating, right? So
that's true.
So if somebody's listening right now and they can set us straight, do so.
Please do.
That's what we're trying to do here, is figure it out and learn more. We're coming from where we
want to know the truth.
Yeah, we're always open to more information and opinions.
Yeah. But going back to the original point, it does seem like SDAM is more connected to aphantasia than amnesia would be.
And I think what throws me, and maybe we can find a better way to define SDAM, but the way they've defined it in that first thing I read, it does sound like aphantasia. Right. And that's why some people speculate that they're the same thing.
See, and I want to go back to that because I was just thinking about that. And if you're going to call them the same, which I think they have similarities, but if you're going to call them the same, then you would need to specify aphantasia as a memory disorder, which I don't think it is. I think they're related, closely tied. I think aphantasia is a prevailing factor and maybe even part of the cause of SDAM. It's very possible. I don't think they're the same thing at all.
All right. Hello there. After we were finished recording the episode, we came across some new information that I think really helps us understand what we were talking about and trying to figure out. We seemed a little bit confused about what SDAM was. And I think this new information is going to help us solidify that a little bit more. At least it helped me solidify it in my mind a little bit more. The question kind of came up of, when did SDAM become a thing, and did they know about aphantasia? So I started wondering, what was the time frame between those two things, between SDAM and aphantasia being named and studied? So I was looking into that, and I came across a comment on an article. So I'm just going to read this comment. It's by Linda Means. SDAM, severely deficient autobiographical memory, is essentially a subset of aphantasia. The term SDAM was invented by Dr. Brian Levine at University of Toronto when he published his first research results of 4 people with aphantasia. I was one of his subjects. This is quoting Linda. His paper was published in 2015, the same year as Adam Zeman's study of the guy who lost his mind's eye after a heart operation. Since the condition, lack of mental imagery, had never been named before, they both came up with their own names. Levine's SDAM refers to the fact that he was studying memory in people with no visual imagery. He had us doing memory tests while hooked up to EEG and fMRI. Zeman was studying the lack of imagination with no visual imagery. Since his term, aphantasia, was sexier than SDAM, it got picked up by the New York Times, then went viral. But if you have aphantasia, you have SDAM, and vice versa. Both scientists did similar studies of brain activity and got similar results in terms of brain activity in aphantasia versus neurotypical people. Okay, so that is information I had never heard before. I didn't know that they were being studied at the same time and didn't really know about each other. And they were coming at it from different perspectives, right? Zeman was studying imagination, where Levine is studying memory loss.
I see the merit in that because they were both studying essentially the same thing, but different. So I can understand how those two would both explain an inability to visualize. I do think aphantasia is better at explaining that because it focuses specifically on the visualization, which is what we tie close to memory so often. And SDAM just seems like a secondary thing that we can tie into it. My main problem is that the lady we've been talking about seems to have such an extreme case of memory loss and things that you can't just say everyone with aphantasia has SDAM and vice versa, because not everybody is having the same experience she is having. So either that lady does not have SDAM, she has something else, or we need to vastly change our definition of SDAM to include something beyond just aphantasia.
Right. I agree. That was the part that I disagree with that. It is not vice versa. They are similar, but they are different. And I like what you said about aphantasia being a little more, you can understand what that is, right? When you read the definition for aphantasia, you know what they mean. When you read the definition for SDAM, it's like, what is that? What is that?
Right. Are you talking about bad memory or are you talking about bad visualization? It feels clouded.
Based on that new information. And I feel like I can say this because I don't think anybody knows what the hell's going on here. They're kind of the same thing, but not really. I have aphantasia, but not SDAM. And then we had this huge conversation about what about amnesia, because amnesia sounds very similar in a lot of ways. So here's what I think after all of this information, and there's probably more out there that could shed new light on that too. But I think SDAM is a mixture of aphantasia and amnesia. It's why some of us with aphantasia don't resonate with SDAM, right? Because we don't have that piece of it. So SDAM is both pieces, the lack of visualization and extreme memory loss. It's a mixture of the two. That makes sense to me. And now I can say I don't have SDAM, but I do have aphantasia. That's the difference.
I'm interested in if you think with, as far as you said, SDAM being a combination of aphantasia and amnesia, do you think it's just a mixture of the two, or do you think there's some causation there? Do you think it's amnesia because of aphantasia or just a relation of the two?
Yeah, so maybe SDAM is simply a form of memory loss that is a result of aphantasia, but only in some people with aphantasia. Aphantasia plus amnesia or just severe memory loss equals SDAM.
That's what it sounds like. It sounds like something we would call more often a syndrome, because a syndrome is like a mixture of different symptoms like put together. So SDAM sounds almost more like a syndrome than a disability, as it's two different conditions that combine and we call it something specific.
It may not be amnesia, right? Because we've talked about amnesia has these specific things where something causes it,
right?
Or these other things where it may just be just severe memory loss that is happening because of aphantasia, but it doesn't happen in all people. I can have aphantasia, but not SDAM, where other people, because they have aphantasia, they have SDAM. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. And that takes it back to just my thought of like, because it does seem like, and I think we're going to talk about this in another episode, but people with aphantasia do tend to have slightly poorer memory than people who can visualize. But do we classify that as SDAM, or do we just say he has aphantasia, so his memory might suffer a little bit?
Right. And I think that's a good point, because that is true. I think that just having aphantasia means that you're going to have some memory problems, right?
Right.
Because even if you can remember pretty well, it's not going to be in the detail and the vivid way that other people do it.
So is that SDAM, or does SDAM have to be really bad memory? Or do we need a different term for really bad memory with aphantasia and keep SDAM more tightly related to just this idea that if you have aphantasia, you're going to have bad memory?
When we talk about McKinnon, who we talked about in that article, or other people with aphantasia that I've interviewed that also have SDAM, there is significant memory loss there. So by saying I have aphantasia and I also have SDAM, now that I understand that, I think that's a fine way to approach it, because since they're so tightly linked, both require no visualization. The only difference is the memory loss is more severe when we're talking about cases of SDAM than we are with cases of aphantasia. Because McKinnon says, they tell me I was in The Sound of Music. I have zero memory of being in The Sound of Music in high school. That's severe, right? That's
different.
Yeah, that's so different than me. I can say I wasn't, but if I was, I could say I was in The Sound of Music and I remember it. I just cannot experience it in that vivid first-person recollection, visual way, where with SDAM, it can be gone. Let's talk a little bit about why our memory tends to weaken with age.
Okay.
So as you grow older, you experience physiological changes that can cause glitches in brain functions you've always taken for granted. It takes longer to learn and recall information. You're not as quick as you used to be. In fact, you may mistake this slowing of your mental processes as true memory loss.
As you age, it's not necessarily that your memory gets worse. For example, there's a difference between static and dynamic memory. Static memory is like just information, just like the President of the United States and things like that, and the names of the 7 Great Lakes and things like that. Where dynamic memory is about more like learning new information, applying information to different settings and scenarios, and like memory that works for you. Okay, so I'm going to list off some things that can affect memory, especially as we age. So we have brain changes, decreased blood flow, hormone and protein decline, dementia, infections, vitamin and folate deficiency, delirium, psychiatric illness, obesity, and cardiovascular disease. Those can all affect people's memory as they age. A lot of physical changes and problems can have a lot of interesting psychological changes. There is one more I want to add to your list, and that's alcohol abuse. It literally shrinks your brain, and that one is linked to long-term memory loss as well.
What kind of comes to my mind is we've talked about SDAM, we've talked about aphantasia, we've talked about amnesia, all the different types of amnesia. And then you add to those, all of these things can also mess with your memory. It just goes back to memory being such a deep, complicated, and mysterious subject in a lot of ways. It's like all of these different things are messing with your memory in all these different ways. And it's interesting to talk about, but what does it all mean? Like, some of it you're born with, some of it is caused by trauma or an accident or an injury or an illness. Other things are caused by just natural aging things. Your brain is changing, you're getting older, you're getting fatter, all these things are messing with your memory. So it seems a little bit amazing that we do as well as we do.
We know we have theories about how memory works and how it's processed and how it's stored. And we've identified areas of the brain that help with that are related to that. But we still don't know the whole picture of how memory even works. So you're right. Like, the fact that we can remember anything at all sometimes seems like the biggest miracle of anything.
All right. Well, thanks, Cole. I appreciate your insights there. I thought that was an interesting discussion.
That was fun.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, follow, and engage with us, and share it with your friends and family as we continue to explore this fascinating subject. For additional information about this episode or Shane's Brain, check out the show notes. Thanks for listening to the Discovering Your Mind podcast. You are beautifully unique.